Political fractures don't always announce themselves. They don't require shouting or confrontation. Sometimes they appear in what isn't said, in who doesn't respond, in the careful silence that follows a clear statement. This is about one of those moments. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made a statement recently. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't designed to go viral. It was a simple observation about how Democratic campaigns are funded and what that funding requires in return. She said that when candidates take corporate PAC money, they're not just accepting donations. They're accepting relationships, expectations, access, and those things shape priorities in ways that voters don't see until it's too late. Nothing shocking there. This is well documented. Candidates who rely on corporate funding often moderate their positions to maintain that funding. It's not corruption in the legal sense. It's just how the system works. But here's what made the statement significant: the silence that followed. Democratic leadership didn't respond. Strategists didn't push back. Senate leadership didn't clarify or correct. They just let it sit there, unanswered. And that silence said more than any statement could have. Because when AOC criticizes Republicans for taking corporate money, Democrats amplify it. When she criticizes corporate influence generally, they nod along. But when she suggests that Democratic candidates might be similarly compromised by their funding sources, the response is nothing. Not disagreement, not defense, just careful, strategic quiet. That's the conflict, not what was said, what wasn't. Let's establish the context. Democrats are preparing for another election cycle. Competitive races, tight margins, expensive campaigns in states where media markets cost millions. The kind of races that require serious money. And that money comes from somewhere. Individual donors contribute, but individual donations are capped. If you're running a Senate race in an expensive state, small dollar fundraising isn't enough. You need larger donations, corporate PACs, industry groups, wealthy bundlers who can coordinate contributions from networks of donors. That's not unique to Democrats. Republicans do the same thing. But Republicans don't claim to be the party fighting corporate power. Democrats do. And that creates a tension. Because when you position yourself as the party of working people while simultaneously depending on corporate funding, you're managing a contradiction. And managing contradictions requires careful messaging. Which is what makes AOC's comment uncomfortable. She wasn't accusing anyone of anything illegal. She wasn't naming specific candidates or donations. She was just pointing out the structural reality. If your campaign depends on corporate money, your priorities will reflect that dependency. Simple, logical, and deeply problematic for Democratic leadership to acknowledge. Because if they agree with her, they're admitting that many Democratic candidates are compromised by their funding. If they disagree, they have to explain why corporate money influences Republicans but not Democrats. And if they stay silent, they're implicitly admitting she's right, but refusing to address it. They chose silence. Now, silence is a strategy, and it's often effective. If you don't engage with criticism, it sometimes fades. Media moves on. Attention shifts. The comment becomes one of many things AOC said that didn't generate follow-up. But this silence is different, because it's not just one statement. It's part of a pattern. Every time AOC raises questions about how Democrats fund campaigns, about which donors get access, about what concessions are made to maintain corporate support, leadership goes quiet. Not defensive, not dismissive, just absent from the conversation. And that absence creates its own message. It suggests that leadership knows she's describing something real, something they can't easily defend, and something they have no intention of changing. Which leaves Democratic voters in an awkward position. They're told that Democrats fight for working families against corporate interests, but they also see Democrats accepting money from those same interests. And when someone points out that contradiction, leadership doesn't explain how both things can be true. They just don't respond. That's not sustainable, because eventually voters notice when their questions aren't answered. Here's where it gets more complicated. AOC's position isn't just about campaign finance. It's about power, about who gets to set the party's agenda, about whether Democrats should prioritize small-dollar grassroots funding even if it means running smaller campaigns, or whether they should take corporate money and compete in expensive media markets. Leadership has already answered that question. They take the corporate money because they believe winning requires it, because they think losing on principle still means losing, because the system doesn't reward purity, it rewards resources, and they're not entirely wrong. Campaigns are expensive. Competitive races require serious funding. Candidates who refuse corporate PACs often get outspent. And money matters. But AOC is asking a different question. She's not asking whether corporate money helps win elections. She's asking what you win if your victory was funded by the interests you claim to oppose. If you win by taking money from pharmaceutical companies, can you actually fight for lower drug prices? If you win with donations from fossil fuel companies, can you credibly push climate policy? If you win because Wall Street funded your campaign, can you regulate Wall Street? Those aren't hypothetical questions. They're questions about what power is for once you have it. and leadership doesn't want to answer them, because the honest answer is, it depends. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, sometimes you try and fail, sometimes you don't try at all. That's not a message you can build a campaign around. So instead of answering, leadership redirects. They talk about Republican obstruction, about Senate rules, about the importance of winning first and worrying about policy later, all of which is true, but none of which addresses AOC's actual point, which is why the silence continues. Now let's look at what this conflict reveals. It's not about AOC versus specific individuals. It's about two incompatible theories of change. One theory says, take the system as it exists, work within it, win power however you can, then use that power to make incremental improvements. Accept compromises because compromises are how you survive long enough to matter. The other theory says, you can't challenge power using the tools power gives you. If you win by playing their game, you've already agreed to their rules. Real change requires rejecting the system that creates the problem, even if that makes winning harder. Both theories have logic, both have historical examples, and neither side will ever convince the other, because they're not disagreeing about tactics, they're disagreeing about what politics is for. Leadership believes politics is about achieving the possible. AOC believes politics is about expanding what's possible. Leadership prioritizes winning elections. AOC prioritizes winning with a mandate that allows meaningful change. Leadership accepts corporate funding as a necessary compromise. AOC sees it as a structural constraint that limits what you can accomplish even if you win. And when those positions collide, there's no middle ground. You either take the money or you don't. You either accept the relationships that come with it or you reject them. There's no compromise position that satisfies both sides, which is why this moment matters. Because it's not just about one statement or one funding cycle, it's about an ongoing fracture inside the Democratic Party that leadership is trying to manage by not acknowledging it exists. They can't defend taking corporate money without alienating progressives. They can't reject it without losing competitive races. So they do neither. They just stay quiet and hope the contradiction doesn't become the story. But AOC keeps making it the story. Not by attacking individuals, by stating the obvious, by pointing out that you can't claim to fight corporate power while depending on corporate funding. And every time she does, the silence that follows confirms she's describing something real. Here's what that silence looks like in practice. When AOC's statement was reported, it got some coverage. Progressive outlets amplified it. A few commentators agreed. Some criticized her for being divisive, but Democratic leadership. No surrogate went on television to explain why she's wrong. No strategist wrote an op-ed defending corporate PACs. No Senate leader gave an interview clarifying party policy. Just quiet. And in politics, when leadership won't defend a position, it means they know the defense won't work, because if they could argue convincingly that corporate money doesn't influence Democratic priorities, they would. If they could show that candidates who take PAC money are just as willing to challenge corporate power as those who don't, they'd make that case. But they can't, because the evidence doesn't support it. So they stay silent, and the silence becomes its own answer. This creates a problem for Democrats that goes beyond funding. It's a credibility problem. When you tell voters you're fighting for them against powerful interests, but you won't explain why you're taking money from those interests, voters start questioning whether you're actually fighting. When you position yourself as different from Republicans on corporate influence, but you use the same funding model, voters start wondering what the difference really is. When someone in your own party points out the contradiction and you don't respond, voters assume it's because you can't, and once credibility erodes, it's very hard to rebuild. That's what AOC's statement exposed. Not a scandal, not corruption, just the uncomfortable reality that Democratic campaigns rely on funding from interests they publicly oppose, and leadership has no good explanation for why that doesn't compromise their ability to govern. Now, none of this will change how elections are funded, at least not immediately. Candidates will keep taking corporate money because they believe they have to. Leadership will keep defending that choice privately, while avoiding defending it publicly, and AOC will keep pointing out the contradiction. The conflict won't resolve. It will continue, quietly, in the space between what's said publicly and what's acknowledged privately. But here's what changes: awareness. More voters are noticing the silence. More progressives are asking why leadership won't engage with these questions. More candidates are feeling pressure to reject corporate PACs, even if it makes fundraising harder. The contradiction AOC identified isn't going away, and the more it's named, the harder it becomes to ignore, which is why leadership is so careful not to respond. Because responding would require either admitting she's right, which undermines their strategy, or explaining why she's wrong, which they can't do convincingly, so they do nothing, and hope the issue fades. But it's not fading. Because the structural problem she's describing isn't about one election or one funding cycle, it's about how power works, about who gets access, about what kind of change is possible when your campaigns are funded by the interest you're supposed to challenge. And those questions don't disappear just because no one answers them. They accumulate. Each time AOC raises the issue and leadership stays silent, the contradiction becomes more visible. Each time a candidate takes corporate money while campaigning as a progressive, the tension increases. Each time voters are told Democrats will fight corporate power without being told how they'll do that while dependent on corporate funding, credibility erodes a little more. This is how fractures grow, not through explosions, through accumulation, small moments that don't resolve, questions that don't get answered, contradictions that don't get addressed, and eventually the gap between what the party says and what it does becomes too wide to ignore. We're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction, and the silence from leadership suggests they know it. Because if they thought AOC was wrong, they'd say so. If they thought the funding model was defensible, they'd defend it. If they thought voters would accept the explanation, they'd provide one. But they don't, because they can't, so they stay quiet. And the quiet becomes louder than any statement could be. This is what political fractures look like before they break open. Not drama, not conflict, just persistent, unresolved tension that institutions try to keep invisible. But invisibility only works if everyone agrees to look away. And AOC isn't looking away. She's not trying to fracture the party, she's not trying to create a crisis, she's just naming what's already there. The contradiction between what Democrats claim to stand for and how they fund the campaigns that keep them in power. Leadership can't make that contradiction disappear by ignoring it. They can only delay the moment when it has to be addressed, and that moment is coming.